Scales and modes are usually taught in the context of their tonic. That means that normally we're learning interval sequences within the space of what we call an octave, or 8 notes. This means that when we're learning scales and modes associated with them, we have to memorize a lot of interval information. Whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone. That can be a lot to keep track of. One thing that we can do instead is narrow our range of vision. Instead of thinking about a whole octave, we can divide up that scale into 2 equal components. Specifically, a sequence of 4 notes that repeats the identical interval sequence. Those interval sequences are separated simply by a whole tone in the middle. Each of these 4-note interval sequences we call a tetra chord. In this case, chord means something like a string. For example, strings on a guitar or strings on a lute, where each time I play a note, it's as if I'm plucking a string. So what I'm discovering is that underlying this larger scale is actually a sequence of 2 tetrachords that have the same interval sequence. Whole tone, semitone. I skip up a whole tone, semitone. This overall interval sequence we can call a major scale, and now I know how to quickly produce a major scale starting on any note. Rather than thinking of a sequence of 7 intervals, I just think of 1 tetrachord in 2 places. For example, let's start with the pitch D instead. I want a whole tone, and a semitone. And then I skip up a whole tone and I reproduce the same tetrachord. Whole tone, semitone. I can do the same thing again using E. Whole tone, semitone. Skip up a whole tone, semitone. I can do the same again with F. I could do the same with G. Now, one thing I can start to notice are certain kinds of patterns. For example, if I'm working with C as a tonic, I see a nice sequence of white notes being used twice. In both cases, 2 whole tones and then a semitone. When I used D as a tonic, I had 1 black note being used in each tetrachord. When I used E, I had 2 black notes. I could shift things around a little bit. For example, I could use E flat, where each tetrachord begins and ends with a black note. Or I could go to D flat major, in which case I have only 1 white note in each tetrachord. Now, these kinds of patterns are interesting and in some senses can make it easier to learn the scales, but there's actually a deeper reason for these kinds of appearances that we need to look at. This is something called circle of fifths, but we're going to approach it in terms of tetrachords, and that's going to be the topic for our next video.